So we are Ross and Janel with JVR Strategies, and we're going to be talking a little bit about how to use AI in an animal sheltering organization type workflow. So, how could people who work in animal sheltering organizations, what ways can the current offerings and products that are out there that we hear about every day, how can those help us save time, get extra information, when we are short for time, right? I think that's going to be the main benefit, right? Is hopefully saving shelter workers time. And today we're going to go over specifically what can AI do for us in terms of analyzing data and understanding, what data are we working with? What types of things can, in this case, we're going to look at ChatGPT. We're on version 5.2 here. And I do have a Plus account, so I do have the subscription. However, all this capability works on a free account as well, though you're going to be limited to the number of conversations you can have in messages. So, as this goes for any sort of conversation you're going to have with the ChatGPT application, you're going to want to start it out, and you'll notice that there's this Add Files button. So what we're going to use here in this example is this public data set from Louisville, Kentucky. And so what you can do is you can add your files directly to this application. So I'm dragging and dropping that right here. And again, this is Louisville Metro, Kentucky. This is a public data set. So, we're not worried about this private information. This is already public out there on the web anyway. In which case, if you're trying to work with these third-party applications, you're talking to an AI that's based in the internet somewhere in the cloud, you're exchanging that information with that company, and you want to preserve some privacy there as well, especially when dealing with personally identifiable information in the text. So what I would suggest is either having an account set up with that third-party organization like ChatGPT or Google, and making sure that they're not sharing your data out. There's some privacy things that you can achieve there, or you could go other methods of scrambling some of that information or removing it from before you upload it. But we just upload that data set. So this is an Excel spreadsheet that is gonna look like this. Let's just take a look at what it looks like real quick. I'm opening up Excel here. And I'm not sure if you can see it on there, but it's just the basic intake and outcome data set. We'll go ahead and start asking some questions. So let's start generally. Just without much of a goal here, we could just say, I want to analyze. Yep.
Because I couldn't see the spreadsheet. You said that the spreadsheet is just intake and outcomes?
Yes. So it's
Okay.
basically the intake and outcome information, which we'll be able to look at a little bit more once we start working with this. But that means that, in an animal sheltering organization, animals are coming into care and they're leaving the facility at some point. And, they might come in from transfer in, a stray intake, owner surrender, a return from a previous adoption. They might leave the shelter in an adoption, or they might be transferred out, or any of the other ways that they might leave the shelter. And so this data set really is just every row is representing a time that animal came into the shelter and a time that an animal left the shelter. And there could be a lot of different reasons we'd want to look at this data and a lot of different things we'd want to come out of it. But let's just start kind of broadly. What is the default if we just ask ChatGPT right now to analyze this data set? So let's keep it simple right now and just see what happens, right? So now, right, it's loading this data set. And what ChatGPT is actually doing under the hood is it will likely write some code that then it's able to actually load that data set into the system in the cloud that it's working with, and then write code that then is actually doing the analysis and running through, aggregating that data, turning it into metrics that we can look at. Right now it's remembering our past interactions, so that's helping for it to know some things for sure. But right away, it's pulling out this data set and it's saying, okay, we have 58,000 records here, and their full intake to outcome life cycle field. So that's what we said before, right? Each row is representing that life cycle, I guess, of an animal coming into the shelter and then leaving. So it's already suggesting, we could look for length of stay, flow, system pressure type analysis. So it knows that I'm thinking about these things before, and now it's suggesting, here's how we can structure this so we can get some information out. And it's going to tell us, what is in the data. So this is even a better way for us to see that this is what the data is actually referring to. We have our animal identifiers for each row. We have all this intake information, why the actual animal entered. Then we have all this outcome information, when did the outcome happen? What was the type? Was it an adoption? A secondary subtype that could be useful in certain situations. Information about the animal, and then different information about, where was it found, where's it coming from, where was the source. And now below here, it's showing us some code, right? This is where ChatGPT at least is able to, write some code that then it's able to run on the data set itself. Sometimes it will just kind of give you the code so that you could run it on your own. However, in this case, we're trying to look at what can it do on its own without us. So it may just be trying to show us the code for it to do. But here's some information, it's doing a calculation of length of stay for each intake and outcome row. And now it knows it needs to separate, which animals have already gone out of the shelter, which animals are still in the shelter by this outdate field being null or not actually in like a missing value.
Ross, will that always do code, or does it like if that popped up for me, I'd be like, I'm confused. Like, what do I do now?
Yeah, good question. So this may just be because it could either do but either one. I'm thinking it's just showing me code because oftentimes I will not upload data that I'm working with, but just discuss things about maybe what should I be thinking about, just as an extra person to run ideas around. But it does have the ability to run code in the background that you don't even necessarily have to look at, which is really interesting, and that's more and more going to be something that's available. What we're seeing here, it's showing us more different things we could do. Just look at the different outcome types. It's already saying, we already know what they are. So it's probably running the code in the background. It's asking, how long do animals stay? It wants to describe this. We can look at slow track animals by saying, okay, well, that calculated length of stay that we just calculated, if it's less than or greater than 30 days, we could call that a slow track animal, meaning they're spending more time in the shelter. But let's keep looking down here. So it's suggesting a lot of different, simple calculations we could do. So it's kind of going through all this, and now we could ask it to actually do something, right? So let's ask it to maybe make some of these visualizations here, right? So we can actually see that it's doing some work with the data. So I'm just going to say, go ahead and make visualizations about let's go for adoption efficiency. Let's see what it actually thinks about adoption efficiency. And while it's doing that, we'll go up and look. Did it talk about adoptions? It said outcome efficiency. What is, yeah, outcome efficiency. So meaning how many days. So adoption efficiency would have to do with, what is the length of stay for animals who get adopted is most likely what it's going to be doing. And so here's an example of, it's written this code here where it is able to run this code, and then it will give us the outcome of the code. So here's all this work that it's doing that we don't have to do, that it loads the file, it's going to convert and clean some of the data file or the fields in the data set, create a new field for that length of stay value, and then it's going to actually do some calculations to get adoption proportion over time. And then we're going to just plot this. And so we should be able to see some graphs here. And it's showing right here, this is what the output of the code actually is on their side, and it's building the font cache, I guess, so that it's able to plot with the font appropriately there. So we're just going to wait a moment, I guess, to see what it's able to put out. Okay, and so it looks like it had an error, or it ended itself as keyboard interrupt. So it's not perfect, of course, and it might fail, but it's trying again. So it's going again. It changed the code a little bit, and now we'll see what happens.
If we're looking at code, because like I said, I can't read code. I don't understand it. Looks like a bunch of hieroglyphics on a screen. How do we know it's wrong then, or if it's correct?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say at this state that it's in, it's not going to be this sort of foolproof system that's always going to give you the right answer. But it's definitely a place where you can start into that process. And I would say, once it is giving you something that, you feel like you can work with, or something you want, then you can really dig down into, all right, is this correct? Are we thinking about everything properly in this calculation? But we're just starting right now by getting to a point where we can see some information. Okay. So it has created, a few of these plots here. And we can look, once we've really picked one that we like, then we'll go in and we can, really look in the data and make sure that it's doing what it needs to. And another way we could do that is, we have the original data set that we started with, that Excel file that we uploaded. And, for instance, we could ask, how can we recreate this to verify this outside of this ChatGPT environment, but rather in the Excel file? And that could be a process that we use. So re-asking, having ChatGPT or whatever large language model you're using sort of be that partner in validating. Have that extra validation step is super important. So good point. So this is pretty simple, right? It's just kind of giving us these basic plots here, which is showing just overall adoption rate by year, because this data set goes from 2020 up to 2024. And, the adoption rate showing that it doesn't change that much. It's going between this 0.32 and 0.26 of the adoption rate. So this Louisville facility, they might have a lot of transfers or other situations where animals are other outcomes besides adoption. This is a municipal shelter, so that's most likely what's happening. Now we can look at a histogram of, what's that length of stay over time. Kind of gives us an idea of, how many animals are staying that longer time period. This 30, or, this is about 50 length of stay. X-axis is length of stay here in days. So you can see, obviously, it's dropping off. Less animals are staying longer. But you can't really tell too much from this chart for exactly. This is looking at, by different animal types. Let's get the median length of stay for each of those animal types, independent of intake type or anything like that. So we could see, dogs in this case have a longer median length of stay for all animals, and then cats are about 4 days. So very, very short length of stay in this population for cats. We can also look at by size, right? Obviously, we'd want to break this down into cats and dogs separately, but this extra large and large are really going to only be in the dogs because we know that. I don't believe this Louisville location says that cats are extra large or anything like that. But, just looking at this here, we can see that small, medium, extra large, large, the medium, extra large, and the large group have these longer length of stays, whereas small animals are not staying as long. However, we don't know. This is just the entire data set, right? So this could include cats. It could include these, birds and other animals that are technically in here, but probably very low numbers. But, we're starting to get at what are some of these differences here. And I just like how it's really going off in all these different tangents of showing us information that, it's not exactly what we want, because what does it mean that all medium animals, no matter independent of how they came in or how they went out, they have a length of stay of a certain median value? That's not as interesting as really dialing in on, let's say, cats who are adopted, right? Or dogs who are adopted. This is interesting. Share of adopted animals staying greater than 30 days. So adoptions greater than 30 days. Dogs about 15%. So that aligns with the fact that we saw the median length of stay with dogs was about 10 days. So, this is saying about 14%, the proportion of all dogs who are adopted are staying more than 30 days. So anytime there's an adoption, 14% of chance that it's a dog who's staying within 30 days. Okay, and let's see what it's saying back to us. It's kind of sycophantic, where it's, just really nice to us and saying we're good. This is a great adoption efficiency snapshot. Tells a clear story about how fast animals are moving through the system and where the friction is. I don't think we've really dialed into that point yet, but it's saying, like, this is what we're trying to do. So we don't want to, take it word for word here, but we want to look at this overall. Here's where, it's actually trying to use this information that it's processed to kind of give these insights and bring this into words. It's saying, 31 to 32% of completed cases that end up in the adoptions for that first graph that we saw. And, it's interpreting likely reflects capacity strain or placement difficulty in these years where they had a lower adoption. That might be true. It depends on, you'd have to know the situation and be at the shelter to really understand those differences. And then noticing that improvement in 2024, so bumping back up to 0.30 here. So it's really trying to work pretty hard, right, and guessing at where things might be. So I wouldn't take this at face value, but it's a really good starting point to how to think about this. And at least if you're seeing that, you just know that, it can at least try to explain what it's doing, and we can follow up and ask that type of question. Yeah, go ahead and talk one more time. I want to make sure your desktop audio is recording on my end.
I did have a question though. So if you go back up,
Yeah.
it says that to what the data says, 31 to 32% ended in adoption. So does that mean the rest were transfers?
Yeah, we should look at that.
Or we'd have to ask it.
Yeah, we can look at that for sure. So what it did here is we asked for like an adoption efficiency calculation. So meaning that it's really only trying to show us this adoption number. But here, this is just saying out of all the outcomes in each year, what percent of the outcomes were adoption. So yeah, I would guess that those are probably going to be other outcome types. And we could see earlier we had run, stats to find out what were the adoptions that came out, right? So the other adoptions, return to owner, transfer, rescue, euthanasia, still in shelter. So we're not looking at those still in the shelter. We're just looking at the other options. So, might have been a lot of return to owner or transfer out. and then least often would have been euthanasia. So we could, after this, we could ask that question. We could say, what are the proportions of other outcome types? Which I think that would be a good thing to do. But basically, all this text it's just automatically trying to, for each of the graphs that we've seen, just describe them in words and come up with a meaning behind them. So, the one where it broke up fast track animals, short proportion of fast track and slow track, the median adoptions for these animal types, and a little bit of information about that, the length of stay by size. We have a gradient being obviously the larger ones are staying longer. And it's, saying this probably is an adopter preference structure of anything, right? More people are likely to get these adoptions for smaller dogs.
How does it know it's not a marketing issue, though?
It doesn't necessarily know that it's a marketing issue. Again, this is where we kind of need to take what ChatGPT says with a grain of salt and understand, what information did we give it, which was just the intake and outcomes, nothing about marketing, right? So this is really where it's trying to draw conclusions that then we need to take and interpret ourselves, which, it could be something, it's probably true, right? But it's
That is
a starting point, right? These are good ideas of why, but we would have to interpret it as our human selves to make sure that we're doing it right. So it's just really going about all these things, giving some good information, really trying to do a lot of work, right? And it's asking, next we could go into all these different things here, but let's just go ahead and say, what are the portions of other outcome types? And so it should still be able to write some code to analyze that itself, right? So it's looking at this out type column, and we're going to actually see.
What happens if you click copy code? What do you do then?
So if you copy code, it's going to essentially copy that to the clipboard so that then you could run that on your own, for instance.
Where do you run that?
You would need to have a Python environment somewhere. The language that it's running is Python. And so, like, for instance, if you have a Macintosh computer, those actually come with Python pre-installed. Or you could use like Google Colab environment, could be another like web-based, Google-based environment that you could run Python in. But you would need to set up Python on your computer and run it, using a text editor like Visual Studio Code or any of the alternatives, even the built-in ones. Like you could write it in Notepad or, Notes. Maybe not Notes in Mac, because that's like, I don't think you can run a Note. But yeah, it's run this code here, but it's able to run on it in its own environment here. So here is the result from what it printed on this summary of count and proportion of our outcome types. So in this situation, it's saying there's still 13,000 animals in shelter, which kind of seems like it's probably wrong to me. We'd have to look into that. I'm not sure. 13,000 animals in the shelter seems like a lot. But here we go, 13,000 for adoptions, right? Then we have animals that went to foster. So this is a case where, this Louisville data set that's public, they actually have foster as an outcome type, meaning that...
I was going to say, that's kind of confusing because it's not an outcome.
Yeah, right? I mean, it does mean that they leave care, and at least the shelter care. Obviously, the shelter is the one coordinating the foster and everything, but they're not in foster during that time. So that's important to understand. If your shelter software is actually recording foster as an outcome type, It'd be something important to know, to be able to say, okay, are animals actually in the shelter or are they not? And if foster is not an outcome type, then you're going to have to know when they're in foster. If foster is an outcome type, you're going to need to know, or you don't necessarily need to know that they're in the shelter. You know it's outcome type foster, so it has left the shelter, and it will probably come back in as an intake type. Sort of those two variations on ways animal shelter software will record that information. But we see, besides adoption, we have the foster, spay, neuter, return is a pretty significant portion, and then return to owner, transfer, euthanasia, trap, neuter, return to field, and then animals who come in who are dead on arrival or died in the shelter, transport out, lost, very small numbers, right? These happen when we have 50,000 records or so. This still in shelter number is really strange, and I would want to look into this if we're really going to be doing an analysis to pull this out, because that number does not seem accurate to me. However, I do believe that that is probably true and accurate within the data set. So it's probably something about the data set that we need to figure out in order to really get, okay, is it 23% of all these animals from 2020 are still in the shelter? I don't think so. So we'd have to investigate what's going on there. However, these numbers are probably pretty accurate. But this, if this is, animals aren't supposed to actually be here, this proportion would go up pretty high. But so, we can see, okay, what else is happening besides adoption? Well, adoption is, primary as the number one outcome. This foster doesn't really count because they could come back in and have an adoption later. So it's all these things we need to know and understand, right? So this is kind of the state, right? Like, this is what's available, right? You have ChatGPT that you can upload this data to and really ask questions ad nauseum, right? Where you're like, okay, we need to understand, what is accurate, what's not. And, you're not limited to just like analyze this data set or give me this graph. We can go in and say, okay, well, we want to look at this specifically, or we want to figure out, why are these still in shelter animals really there in this data set? That seems like too many. And, in this state right now, there's a lot that still needs to be done, but we can see that, this gives a really good starting point to try to understand or analyze the data. So let's say you're working at a shelter and you're interested in understanding some portion of the data, making use of your data, right? Let's say it's, you want to understand, for instance, neonates, what's live, you're trying to calculate live release rate in general, right? So we could ask that and have it try to calculate this live release rate, and maybe we're having trouble with our shelter software's ability to, just isolate neonates, for instance, or animals of a certain age, right? So we could ask that question. And just as our last thing here, let's just see how it'll handle this. So I want to calculate live release rate for, let's say, cats or dogs. Which should we?
Let's do cats.
Okay, for cats, neonate cats, and we'll say less than 8 weeks at intake. Let's see how it does this, right? So kind of gives you a starting point to be able to ask more complex questions than what your shelter software is going to give you from the beginning, or at least help you maybe if you want to generate your own report, let's say in PetPoint or Shelter Buddy or Shelter Love, that is going to actually give you what you want. Doing this process can help you really orient what you need, what information is necessary for that process. And it takes some time because it's, it's running this code, writing the code, what it's done here is it just loaded the data and printed out, what data points or columns or, fields do we have available in our data set. So these are just, the columns you would see in the Excel file. It needed to print that out so that it understood, how is it going to be able to calculate this and isolate that neonate group. And now once it realized that information, it's going to run more code that then it can say, okay, if it's a cat or kitten, neonate, has it done any age information here? We're not sure. So we don't have age in this data set. So, right, so that's an issue that we have here. Right now it's just saying let's add cat and kitten together. So, if you're really trying to have it do a calculation, you'd want it to make sure that it has the data that it can actually do that calculation. And hopefully it'll tell you that it can, right? It looks like it had some issues here, and so it needs to print out, what is the pet size of these cats so that it can actually use that.
So essentially, if you don't even have the right data, you can't really use ChatGPT to answer your questions if you don't get the right data in the first place.
Right. And, for instance, like if you're not tracking things like fosters going out, or that information might not be there. And, it's going to make some mistakes. So what it found was that in the pet size, it had kitten as a pet size, which is going to be defined within the shelter, right? It's not obvious just in the data set how this is defined. It depends on how the people are actually recording this information. And what it found was that there were actually no kittens in the data set, meaning that this animal type field here is just cat and kitten, which we saw, in the graphs before where it said dog and cat and then other, and, it didn't have kitten and puppy specifically. So that's another feature of the software that they're using. So what it's using here is it's going through and saying cat and kitten. So it doesn't fully understand. So you do definitely need to understand what's going on in the data set and what's going here. But it's doing a good job of at least telling us what happened, right? There's no age field in this data set, so we can't directly identify less than 8 weeks with what we have. They chose to use this pet size equals kitten as a proxy for kittens. However, it got all cats and it got the kitten. So it's basically just all cats anyway. We're assuming anything with pet size kitten was also under cat because there is no kitten. So really this calculation it's going to be doing is just based on all cats. And that number is 9,000 here. What it's doing, it's calculating 3 ways to strict live release rate. So the adoption, return to owner, and transfer only outcomes over every other outcome. 47.7% here, which we'd want to, really look at and make sure if that's what we're going to be using. Now it's including all these other options. If we include foster, which is not a final outcome but is operational and critical, so for neonates, then it really bumps up. What I would say, we would probably want to really define based on what our fields are, what is going to be that live release rate. And I would say that, anything with foster as an outcome, we should technically not count as an intake to an outcome, right? Mm-hmm. We're just worried about outcomes that are really leaving the system, and the foster should just be removed from that overall calculation that we're doing. So building exactly the context to give the AI information on what it should be calculating is going to get you more results than just asking a general thing and having it come up with some numbers here. It's trying to get these insights on this, right? So what I would say here is, right, what needs to be done is really defining based on your shelter intake and outcome, in this case really just the outcome, and isolating what's important, what actually means they're leaving the shelter, and recalculating that. So what I would say is the next step here is to either get another data set that actually has this age in it, right? Or just continue with cats itself or isolate just the size for kittens, even though they're a very small number, and have it recalculate, right? So that ability to keep asking those questions. So, this is going to keep getting better. And, we just want people to know that there is an ability for applications of AI like ChatGPT to do some analysis on your data and at least talk to you about it, right? We shouldn't treat it as, okay, it knows every single thing about your shelter or even everything about doing shelter statistics. But the truth is it's really this tool that you can sort of hack away at the data set and help you ask questions and, get some answers that you should check that then can help you really get to your final goal of whatever analysis you want on your data. And, as this gets better, we'll definitely keep sharing other ways that, you can use this, but we just wanted to give folks a good example of, what it's like today to give ChatGPT some of your shelter data and, what is it like conversating with ChatGPT about this? What is it capable of? What to expect, right? It's not always going to be perfect, but it's that starting point that you can use.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's helpful in well, one, it's helpful to just get used to it because you gotta practice makes perfect type thing. And but it also shows where, I mean, this is how I would interpret it, where I'm missing data that I need to go back and make sure that I'm tracking. So it's kind of nice to see that and like have ChatGPT run through that because now I know I need to go back and track this particular amount of data so that way I can actually get like a question like that we just asked with like the neonates, for instance. I can get that answer later on down the road.
Right. So yeah, let's say you're working in the shelter and someone in management has asked you to, pull a report to try to understand, like, let's see about these neonates and we need to calculate live release for them. You could pull that report. Obviously, you'd want to remove some person identifiable information and you could upload it to this and, talk through, okay, can I get this age out of this report that I have right here? How can I determine this? And, have it be able to load that data set, look through the values, and then determine, okay, here's what I found. Is this possible to get this age out? And then, it found that it was not possible. And I agree based on what it said, it's showing all of these fields, right? Which none of them have anything to do with age or birth date or anything like that. So really, whatever this report is, which is the publicly available Louisville report, they do not carry that age value with whatever this report is. However, we're pretty certain that we don't work for Louisville, but we're pretty certain that they're going to be recording like a birth date estimate or a known birthday or some age, right? That's in the system somewhere because that's very important for animal sheltering in general. So this would have told us, okay, if we want to know anything about neonates, we're going to have to find a different report to use. And so that's the outcome in terms of this neonate question we were trying to look at here. But yeah, so super cool stuff. Yeah, thanks for listening.